The gunshot that shattered the morning stillness of Ash Fork, Arizona wasn't meant for Grace Kennedy, but it might as well have been, because the man it killed was her only way out of the crushing debt that threatened to bury her alive. She stood frozen in the dusty street, her flour-covered apron still tied around her waist, watching as two men carried Sheriff Thomas's body past the bakery where she had been working since dawn. The blood trail they left in the red dirt seemed to mirror the path her life had taken since her father's death 6 months earlier, each drop a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still owed. Grace pressed her palm against the rough wooden doorframe, her knuckles white beneath the coating of flour dust. Sheriff Thomas had promised to help her find legitimate work, the kind that paid enough to settle the $300 her father owed to Clayton Marsh, the banker who now owned the deed to her family's small ranch just outside of town. $300 might as well have been $3,000 for a 22-year-old woman alone in Arizona territory in 1882, with nothing but her father's debts and a failing bakery that barely earned enough to keep her fed. Miss Kennedy. The voice came from behind her, smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Marsh's son, Peter, who had made his intentions toward her crystal clear ever since her father died. Tragic about the sheriff. I suppose you have lost your advocate in this town. Grace forced herself to turn slowly, keeping her expression neutral despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Peter Marsh stood in the doorway of her bakery, his expensive suit incongruous against the rough-hewn interior. He was handsome in the way that predators often are, all sharp edges and calculated charm. The sheriff was a good man, Grace said quietly, moving behind the wooden counter that separated them. The barrier felt inadequate, but it was something. The town will mourn his loss. The town will move on, Peter replied, stepping further inside. The morning light caught the gold watch chain stretched across his vest, a display of wealth that seemed deliberately cruel given her circumstances. As must you, Miss Kennedy. My father wanted me to remind you that your payment is due in 2 weeks. The 1st of September, as agreed. 2 weeks. 14 days to find $300 or lose the last piece of her father that remained. The ranch wasn't much, just 20 acres of scrubland and a house that needed more repairs than she could count, but it was hers. It was home. It was the place where her mother had taught her to bake bread and her father had taught her to ride. It was the place where she had buried them both, one to fever and one to a heart that gave out under the weight of financial ruin. I am aware of the deadline, Grace said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. I intend to honor my father's debt. Peter's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. I am certain you do. My father also wanted me to convey that should you find yourself unable to secure the funds, he would be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. I have expressed my own willingness to help, should you choose to accept my companionship. The offer was as clear as it was revolting. Marry Peter Marsh, and the debt would disappear. Become property of a different kind to escape the loss of property she loved. Grace had been raised to be polite, to be proper, to accept her place in the world with grace befitting her name, but 6 months of grinding poverty and constant fear had worn away much of her tolerance for pretty words hiding ugly intentions. Thank you for the message, she said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. I have bread in the oven. Peter's expression hardened, the veneer of civility cracking just enough to show the entitled anger beneath. You would do well to remember that options for women in your position are limited, Miss Kennedy. My offer is generous. Your offer is noted, Grace replied, turning her back on him in a gesture that was probably foolish but felt necessary. She could feel his stare burning into her shoulders as she walked toward the brick oven set into the back wall. Could hear the moment when he finally turned and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Only when the door closed behind him did she let herself sag against the work table, her hands gripping the floury surface until her fingers ached. The bread in the oven wasn't burning, but it would be soon if she didn't focus. She forced herself to move, to pull the loaves out with the long wooden peel, to set them on the cooling racks with hands that shook despite her best efforts to steady them. The bakery had been her father's last desperate attempt to keep them afloat. He had spent his final dollars on the equipment, the flour, the yeast, convinced that Grace's skill with bread would be their salvation. He died 2 weeks after they opened, his heart giving out while she mixed dough in the pre-dawn darkness. She had found him slumped over the account books, his hand still holding the pen, the numbers on the page showing exactly how far they were from breaking even. She kept the bakery running because she didn't know what else to do. The bread was good, people told her so, but good bread didn't pay off $300 in debt. Good bread didn't stop bankers from foreclosing. Good bread didn't keep predatory men from making offers that felt like threats wrapped in silk. The bell above the door chimed, and Grace looked up to see Margaret Foster, the minister's wife, entering with her basket. Margaret was one of the few people in Ashfork who treated Grace with genuine kindness, though even that kindness came with the pitying looks of someone who knew exactly how dire her circumstances were. "Good morning, Grace dear," Margaret said, her smile warm despite the lines of concern around her eyes. "I will take 3 loaves today. We are having the church ladies over tomorrow, and your bread is far superior to anything I could make." "Thank you, Mrs. Foster," Grace said, wrapping the loaves in brown paper with quick, practiced movements. "That is very kind of you to say." Margaret counted out the coins, adding an extra nickel that Grace pretended not to notice. Charity, even well-meaning charity, stung worse than honest payment, but she pocketed the coins without comment. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I heard about Sheriff Thomas," Margaret said softly. "Such a terrible thing. They say it was Ace Bailey who shot him, though he claims it was self-defense." "Ace Bailey," Grace looked up sharply. The name was familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. "A drifter," Margaret explained, lowering her voice as though the walls might hear. "He rode into town 3 days ago. Quiet man, keeps to himself mostly. Been staying at the boarding house and doing odd jobs. Sheriff Thomas tried to arrest him this morning on suspicion of cattle rustling, and Bailey drew on him. At least, that is the story going around." Grace's stomach twisted. If Bailey was a murderer, there would be a trial, probably a hanging. But if he really was just defending himself, then another innocent man would be lost to the violence that seemed to seep into every corner of life in the territory. Either way, it was none of her concern. She had her own problems. Margaret gathered her wrapped loaves and paused at the door. "Grace, dear, if you ever need anything at all, please do not hesitate to call on me. The church has a discretionary fund that might be able to help with your situation." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Foster," Grace said, though they both knew that the church's discretionary fund wouldn't cover a fraction of what she owed. "Truly, I do." After Margaret left, Grace spent the rest of the morning in the mechanical rhythm of her work. Knead dough, shape loaves, tend the fire, sell bread to the handful of customers who trickled in. Each transaction added a few more coins to the small leather pouch she kept hidden beneath the counter. But when she counted it during the lunch hour, the total was barely $15. $15 saved over 6 months of work. At this rate, She would need 10 years to pay off her father's debt. The afternoon brought fewer customers. Grace cleaned the work surfaces, swept the floor, and tried not to think about Peter Marsh's smile or the deadline that loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. She was pulling the last batch of rolls from the oven when the door opened again, bringing with it a blast of hot September air and a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with the kind of weathered face that came from years in the sun. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he wore his gun low on his hip in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue and startlingly direct, with a depth to them that suggested he had seen more than his share of hardship. "Afternoon," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with dust. "You would be Miss Kennedy." Grace straightened, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after a day spent covered in flour and sweat. "I am. Can I help you?" "Name is Ace Yardley," he said, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. This was the man who had shot Sheriff Thomas. This was the man the whole town was whispering about. "I was hoping to buy some bread if you have any to spare." Her hand moved instinctively toward the knife she kept on the counter for cutting dough, though what she thought she would do with it against a man who wore a gun like other men wore shirts, she didn't know. "I heard what happened this morning." "I expect you did," Ace replied, his tone neutral. "Small town like this, news travels faster than wildfire. I am guessing you also heard that Sheriff Thomas drew on me first. I heard you were accused of cattle rustling." "Accused, yes. Guilty, no." He set his hat on the counter between them, a gesture that felt oddly intimate, like he was trying to show he meant no harm. "I was moving a herd for the Double R Ranch up north. Had papers to prove it, but the sheriff didn't give me much chance to explain before he went for his gun. I defended myself. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, I understand, but I would still appreciate the bread." Grace studied him, trying to reconcile the calm, almost gentle man in front of her with the image of a killer. There was something in his eyes, a sadness or maybe a weariness, that made her think he was telling the truth. Or perhaps she just wanted to believe him because she understood what it was like to be judged without being given a chance to explain. 20 cents for a loaf," she said finally, reaching for one of the rolls still cooling on the rack. 30 if you want rolls instead." "I will take both," Ace said, fishing coins from his pocket. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for whatever he earned. When he set the coins on the counter, he included an extra dime. "For your trouble." "That is not necessary," Grace said, but he had already picked up his hat. "Maybe not," he agreed, "but you look like someone who could use a little extra kindness if you do not mind my saying so. And in my experience, good bread is worth more than what most people charge for it." He was gone before she could respond, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft chime that seemed too cheerful for the strange encounter. Grace stared at the coins on her counter, at the extra dime that gleamed in the afternoon light, and felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too fragile, too dangerous. But it was something. The rest of the day passed without incident. She closed the bakery as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, turning the Arizona sky into a canvas of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had the energy to appreciate it. Instead, she counted her earnings, added them to the leather pouch, and tried not to calculate how many days she had left before Peter Marsh came calling again. She was walking home along the dusty Main Street when she saw Ace Yardley again. He was standing outside the sheriff's office with 3 other men, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face expressionless as they led him inside. A temporary sheriff, someone told her later, had been appointed until a new election could be held. They were holding Ace until the territorial judge could arrive to hear his case. Grace told herself it was none of her business. Ace Yardley was a stranger who had bought bread from her once. Whether he hanged or went free had nothing to do with her or her problems. But she found herself thinking about him as she walked the remaining mile to the ranch, her feet aching in her worn boots, her mind circling the same thought over and over. He had called her someone who looked like she could use a little extra kindness. Not pity. Kindness. As though there was a difference. As though he understood what it was like to be judged, to be cornered, to be running out of options. The ranch looked even more desolate than usual in the fading light. The house needed paint it would never get. The barn leaned slightly to the left, and the garden her mother had once tended was now nothing but dried weeds and dust. Grace fed the 2 chickens that were all that remained of their livestock, drew water from the well for herself, and ate a cold dinner of day-old bread and the last of the preserves. She tried to sleep, but the numbers kept running through her head. $15 saved. $285 still owed. 14 days left. No plan. No hope. No options except the one that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn. When she finally did sleep, she dreamed of her father's funeral, of standing alone beside a fresh grave, of Peter Marsh offering his hand and her taking it, because there was nothing else to hold on to. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and walked back into town to start another day of baking bread she couldn't afford to eat. The next few days fell into the same exhausting pattern. Wake, walk, bake, sell, walk, sleep. The coins accumulated with agonizing slowness. The deadline approached with terrifying speed. Peter Marsh came by the bakery twice more, each time making his offer sound more like an ultimatum. Grace smiled politely and said she would consider his proposal, and they both knew she was lying. On the 4th day after Sheriff Thomas's death, Margaret Foster came by with news. "The territorial judge arrived this morning," she said, her voice hushed with the weight of important information. "They are holding Ace Yardley's trial this afternoon at 2 o'clock. The whole town will be there, I expect. The new sheriff is certain it will be a quick conviction." "What makes him so certain?" Grace asked, though she told herself she didn't care. "Ace Yardley has a reputation," Margaret said, leaning closer. "My husband asked around. Apparently he is known throughout the territory as a gun for hire. He has worked as a cowboy, a ranch hand, even a bounty hunter. He has been involved in more than a few killings, though always on the right side of the law. Until now, anyway." Grace's hand stilled in the dough she was kneading. A bounty hunter, a killer, and yet when he had stood in her bakery he had seemed almost gentle. But then appearances meant nothing. Peter Marsh looked like a gentleman and he was anything but. "Will there be a defense?" she asked. "He will represent himself, I suppose." "He has no money for a lawyer, and the court will not provide one for a man accused of murdering a sheriff." Margaret shook her head sadly. "It seems a foregone conclusion, does it not? They will hang him by week's end." Grace finished the loaf she was working on and set it aside to rise. "That seems very efficient," she said, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. "Justice without mercy." "Justice must be served," Margaret replied, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "A sheriff was killed." After Margaret left, Grace tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the trial. She told herself it was morbid curiosity, nothing more. But when 2 o'clock approached, she found herself untying her apron, locking the bakery door and walking toward the church where the trial was being held. The regular courthouse was being repaired, someone had told her, so they were using the church instead. The building was packed. It seemed Margaret was right about the whole town attending. Grace squeezed into a space near the back, standing because all the pews were full. She could see Ace Yardley at the front, standing beside a makeshift defendant's table, his hands no longer cuffed but his expression no less resigned. The territorial judge was a severe-looking man with gray hair and a face that suggested he had never smiled in his life. The prosecution's case was exactly what Margaret had described. Ace Yardley was a known gun hand. Sheriff Thomas had attempted to arrest him on suspicion of cattle rustling. Yardley had drawn his weapon and shot the sheriff dead. 3 witnesses testified to seeing Ace with his gun drawn, the sheriff on the ground. None of them had seen who drew first. When it was Ace's turn to defend himself, he stood slowly, looking out at the crowd with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I have worked as a cowboy and a ranch hand across 3 territories for the past 10 years, he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "I have hired my gun when the work was legal, and I have done what was necessary to survive. But I have never stolen cattle, and I have never killed a man who didn't draw on me first." "You admit to killing Sheriff Thomas," the judge said flatly. "I admit to defending myself when he drew his weapon. I had papers proving I was moving the double Articus herd legally. He didn't give me a chance to show them to him. He accused me, and when I tried to explain, he went for his gun. I was faster. That is the truth of it." "A convenient truth," the prosecutor said, "given that the only other witness to the encounter is dead. Convenient or not, it is the truth." The trial lasted less than an hour. The judge deliberated for perhaps 5 minutes before pronouncing Ace Yardley guilty of manslaughter. The sentence was 5 years in the territorial prison, to be served starting immediately. It was a lighter sentence than hanging, but Grace could see from Ace's expression that it might as well have been death. 5 years in prison in the Arizona Territory was often a death sentence of a different kind. As the crowd began to disperse, Grace found herself moving against the flow, pushing toward the front where they were preparing to take Ace away. She didn't know what she was doing or why, only that something in her chest was pulling her forward, making her speak before her mind could caution her to silence. "Mr. Yardley," she called out, and he turned, surprise flickering across his face when he recognized her. "Miss Kennedy," he said. "I did not expect to see you here." "I wanted to," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "I believe you, I am sorry," neither seemed adequate. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the bread." For the first time since she had seen him, Ace smiled. It was a small thing, barely a quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face, made him look younger and less weary. "That is possibly the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me while I was being sentenced to prison, Miss Kennedy, but I appreciate it nonetheless." "Time to go, Yardley," one of the deputies said, taking his arm. Ace nodded, but his eyes stayed on Grace for another moment. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and do not let the bastards grind you down. Sometimes the only thing that keeps us going is stubborn spite." Then he was gone, led away in chains while the town dispersed to discuss the trial over dinner tables and in saloons. Grace walked back to her bakery in a daze, unsure why her chest felt so tight or why tears were threatening to spill down her cheeks. She didn't know Ace Yardley. He was nothing to her, just a stranger who had bought bread and offered an extra dime he probably couldn't afford, but he had looked at her like he understood, like he saw her, really saw her, in a way no one else in this town did. And now, he was going to prison for defending himself against a corrupt sheriff in a trial that barely resembled justice. Grace unlocked the bakery and went through the motions of closing up properly, her mind elsewhere. She was so distracted that she almost didn't notice the envelope that had been slipped under the door. It was thick, made of expensive paper, with her name written across the front in careful script. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a stack of bills that made her knees go weak. She sank onto the stool behind the counter, staring at the money with disbelief that bordered on shock. $300. Exactly $300. The letter was brief. "Miss Kennedy, I understand you have certain financial obligations that weigh heavily upon you. Please accept this payment of a debt long overdue. Everyone deserves a fresh start. Use this to claim yours." It was unsigned. Grace read the letter 3 times, counted the money 4 times, and still couldn't quite believe it was real. $300. Her father's debt paid in full. But by whom? And why? The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper too expensive to belong to anyone she knew. She thought immediately of Margaret Foster and the church's discretionary fund, but Margaret would have told her directly, would have made it about charity and Christian duty. This felt different. This felt deliberate, anonymous, like someone had been watching her struggle and decided to intervene without seeking credit or gratitude. Peter Marsh. The thought made her feel sick, but she forced herself to consider it. Could he have paid her debt as some kind of twisted gesture, thinking it would obligate her to him? But no, Peter wanted leverage over her. Paying off her debt would eliminate his best tool for forcing her hand. She sat in the gathering darkness of her bakery, the money spread across the counter like cards in a game she didn't understand, and tried to make sense of the gift. Because that was what it was, despite the letter's careful wording. A gift. An impossibly generous, life-changing gift from someone who wanted nothing in return, except for her to have a fresh start. The next morning, Grace walked to the bank as soon as it opened, the $300 secured in the leather pouch that had once held her pitiful savings. Clayton Marsh looked surprised to see her, then skeptical when she said she was there to pay off her father's debt. "You have $300, he asked, his tone making it clear he thought she was lying. "I do." Grace placed the pouch on his desk with a solid thunk that brought her more satisfaction than it probably should have. "I would like the deed to my ranch, please." Marsh counted the money twice, examining each bill as though expecting to find them counterfeit. But the money was real, and eventually he had no choice but to open his safe and retrieve the deed with her father's name on it. He watched with undisguised displeasure as she signed the paperwork transferring the debt to paid and the property back to her free and clear. "May I ask where you acquired such a sum?" he said as she was preparing to leave. "Does it matter?" Grace replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The debt is paid. My business with your bank is concluded." She walked out with her head high, and the deed clutched in her hands like a talisman against the darkness that had been closing in around her for months. She made it halfway down the street before the reality of what had just happened hit her, and she had to stop, pressing her back against the wall of the general store, breathing deeply until the tears stopped threatening to fall. Someone had saved her. Someone had given her back her life, her home, her future, and she had no idea who. The mystery consumed her for the next several days. She asked careful questions of everyone who came into the bakery, trying to figure out who might have the money and the inclination to help her. But no one seemed to know anything, and most people were more interested in discussing Ace Yardley's departure to prison than Grace Kennedy's sudden good fortune. It was Margaret Foster who finally gave her a clue, though she didn't realize it at the time. "It is a shame about Ace Yardley," Margaret said while purchasing her weekly bread. "I heard from my husband that Yardley had nearly $500 on him when he was arrested. Apparently, he had just been paid for delivering that cattle herd. The money is being held until his sentence is complete. $500, can you imagine? And now it will just sit in the sheriff's office for 5 years. $500, $300 to Grace, leaving $200 for Ace. enough to pay her debt and still have funds left over for himself, except he had given her more than half of everything he had, and now he was going to prison with nothing. Grace set down the bread she had been wrapping, her hands suddenly numb. "Did you say $500? "That is what I heard. Why do you ask?" But Grace couldn't answer. She was too busy trying to breathe through the realization that was crashing over her like a flash flood. Ace Yardley had paid her debt. Ace Yardley, who had stood in her bakery and called her someone who looked like she could use a little extra kindness. Ace Yardley, who was now sitting in a prison cell with nothing to his name because he had given it all to her. "I have to go," Grace said abruptly, untying her apron and heading for the door. "But Grace, your shop," Margaret called after her. Grace didn't stop. She ran down the street toward the sheriff's office, her skirts tangling around her legs, her heart pounding against her ribs. The temporary sheriff was a man named Douglas, younger than Thomas had been and seemingly more interested in the job's salary than its responsibilities. He looked up in surprise when Grace burst through the door. "Miss Kennedy," he said, rising from behind the desk. "Is something wrong?" "I need to see Ace Yardley," Grace said, breathless from her run. Douglas frowned. "Yardley was transferred to the territorial prison yesterday. He is gone, Miss Kennedy. And even if he were here, I could not let you see him. Regulations do not allow for visitors to prisoners awaiting transfer." Yesterday, she had missed him by a single day. Grace felt something crack inside her chest, a desperate urgency that made her want to scream or cry or both. "Where is the prison?" "Yuma," Douglas said. "But Miss Kennedy, I do not think you understand. The Yuma Territorial Prison is nearly 200 miles from here. It is not a journey a woman should make alone, and even if you did, they would not let you see him. He is a convict." "He paid my debt," Grace said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Ace Yardley paid my debt with his own money, and now he is in prison with nothing, and I did not even get to thank him." Douglas's expression shifted from confused to uncomfortable. "I see. Well, I am sorry to hear that, Miss Kennedy, but there is nothing I can do. Perhaps you could write him a letter, as though words on paper could possibly convey what she needed to say." But Douglas was right that she couldn't travel to Yuma alone, and even if she could, they wouldn't let her see him. Grace nodded slowly, backing toward the door. "Thank you, Sheriff Douglas. I appreciate your time." She walked back to the bakery in a fog, opened the door to customers waiting for bread, and went through the motions of serving them with a smile that felt painted on. Her mind was racing, trying to understand why Ace had done what he did. They were strangers. She had sold him bread. That was the extent of their interaction. Why would he give her his money? Why would he sacrifice his own security for hers? Everyone deserves a fresh start. That was what the letter had said. But what about Ace? Didn't he deserve a fresh start too? Instead, he was in prison, paying for defending himself and for the kindness of helping someone he barely knew. That night, Grace sat at the small desk in her father's house, a piece of writing paper in front of her and a pen in her hand. She wrote and discarded a dozen drafts before finally settling on words that felt inadequate but honest. "Dear Mr. Yardley, I recently learned that you were the one who paid my father's debt. I cannot begin to express my gratitude for your extraordinary kindness. You saved me from a terrible situation, and I am in your debt now, though I know you would say I owe you nothing. I wish I had known before you were sent away. I wish I could have thanked you properly. I wish many things, but mostly I wish that you had kept the money for yourself. Everyone deserves a fresh start, as you said. I hope that when your sentence is complete, you will come back to Ash Fork so that I can try to repay even a fraction of what you have given me. With sincere gratitude, Grace Kennedy." She sent the letter the next day, addressed to Ace Yardley at the Yuma Territorial Prison, and tried not to think about whether he would ever receive it or what he might think if he did. Then she threw herself into work with renewed purpose. Ace had given her a fresh start. The least she could do was make something of it. The weeks passed, then months. Grace expanded the bakery, buying better equipment and experimenting with new recipes. She hired a young woman to help with the baking, which freed her to also sell eggs and preserves made from the garden she had started replanting at the ranch. The business grew slowly but steadily. People noticed the change in her, the way she held herself with more confidence, the way she smiled more easily. Peter Marsh stopped coming by after his father confirmed that her debt was paid. Grace heard through town gossip that Peter was courting a woman from Prescott, and she felt nothing but relief. Clayton Marsh continued to give her cold looks whenever their paths crossed, but he had no power over her anymore. She owed him nothing. She wrote to Ace once a month, telling him about the bakery, the town, the way the desert bloomed in spring. She didn't know if he read her letters or if they even reached him, but writing them became a ritual, a way of maintaining a connection to the man who had changed her life. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more, but late at night when she couldn't sleep, she found herself thinking about his eyes, the way he had smiled when she thanked him for bread, the gentle way he had spoken despite the hardness of his life. The second year passed, then the third. Grace's bakery became the most successful business in Ash Fork aside from the saloon and the general store. She bought back her father's cattle brand and started rebuilding the herd with the help of a ranch hand she hired. The house got its paint, the barn got straightened, and the garden flourished under her care. She was successful by any measure, independent and secure, but she was lonely. She hadn't realized how lonely until she caught herself waiting for customers who reminded her of Ace, tall men with weathered faces and kind eyes. She went to church socials and town dances, and men expressed interest, but she found reasons to decline their invitations. They weren't him. They didn't understand what it meant to give everything for someone else's fresh start. In the fourth year of Ace's sentence, Grace began making plans. She saved money specifically for his release, determined to help him the way he had helped her. She would offer him a job at the ranch, or if he wanted to move on, she would give him the funds to start fresh somewhere else. It was the least she could do. It was what she told herself she wanted to do. The truth, which she barely admitted even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that she wanted to see him again. She wanted to thank him in person. She wanted to know if the connection she felt, the strange recognition that had passed between them in her bakery 4 years ago, was real or just her imagination. She was preparing for the fall harvest, her fourth since Ace had paid her debt, when a letter arrived. Not one of hers, returned undelivered as happened sometimes, but a new letter, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Dear Miss Kennedy, I want to thank you for your letters. They have been a light in a very dark place. I am writing to let you know that I am being released early for good behavior. My sentence has been reduced to 4 years, and I will be free on November 15th. I do not know what I will do or where I will go, but I wanted you to know, in case you were wondering. I hope your bakery continues to thrive. I hope you have found the happiness you deserve. Please do not feel obligated to respond or to remember a man who was only briefly part of your life. Your kindness in writing to me has been more than I had any right to expect. With respect and admiration, Ace Yardley." November 15th, 2 months away. Grace read the letter so many times she could recite it from memory. He was getting out early. He would be free. And he had no plans, no place to go, no one waiting for him. She wrote back immediately. "Dear Ace, I am overjoyed to hear of your early release. I hope this does not presume too much, but I would like to offer you a job on my ranch when you are freed. I have rebuilt it into something I think would make my father proud, and I could use someone with your experience. The pay is fair, and the work is honest. More than that, I would like very much to see you again and to thank you properly for everything you have done for me. If you are interested, please come to Ash Fork when you are released. I will be waiting. Yours, Grace Kennedy. She sent the letter and spent the next 2 months in a state of anxious anticipation that made it hard to focus on anything. She found herself constantly checking the calendar, counting down the days. November 15th fell on a Wednesday. She told her assistant to mind the bakery and waited at the ranch, watching the road from dawn until dusk. He didn't come that day, or the next, or the next. By the following Monday, Grace had convinced herself that he wasn't coming at all. He had received her letter and decided he wanted nothing to do with her or her offer. Why would he? She was just the woman whose debt he had paid. He probably regretted it. He probably wanted to forget the whole thing and start fresh somewhere far away from Ash Fork and its memories. She was feeding the chickens on Tuesday evening when she saw the rider approaching. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, and for a moment she thought she was imagining him. But as he drew closer, she recognized the tall figure on the dusty horse, the way he sat in the saddle like he had been born there. Ace Yardley had come back. Grace set down the feed bucket and walked toward him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. He dismounted slowly, as though giving her time to change her mind, and removed his hat in the same gesture she remembered from 4 years ago. "Miss Kennedy," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, worn by years of hard labor and harder living. "I apologize for the delay. I had some things to settle before I could come." "You came," Grace said, and heard the breathless wonder in her own voice. "I was afraid you would not." "I almost did not," Ace admitted. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, with new lines around his eyes and scars she hadn't seen before. But his eyes were the same, that pale blue that seemed to see straight through her. "I am not sure what you expect from me, Miss Kennedy. I am not a good man. I have done things that would make you think twice about having me on your land." "You paid my debt when you had no reason to," Grace said firmly. "You gave me everything you had so that I could have a fresh start. That sounds like a good man to me." Ace's expression was complicated, somewhere between gratitude and pain. "I paid your debt because you reminded me of my sister. She died in debt, working herself to death trying to pay off what our father owed. I could not help her, but I could help you. It was not heroic, Miss Kennedy, it was selfish. It was me trying to make peace with failing someone I loved." Grace's throat tightened. "I am sorry about your sister." "So am I." Ace turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture that made him seem younger. "I should not have come. You do not owe me anything, and I do not want you to feel obligated to offer me work out of some sense of debt." "I am not offering because I feel obligated," Grace said. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing right in front of him. Close enough to see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that he was not good enough, not worthy of kindness after what he had been through. "I am offering because I want you here. I have wanted you here for 4 years. I wrote to you every month because I could not stop thinking about you, wondering if you were all right, hoping you would survive prison and come back." "Grace," he said, her name soft on his lips, intimate in a way that made her shiver. "I know it sounds foolish," she continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "We barely know each other. We met once for 5 minutes in a bakery. But you saw me, really saw me, when everyone else in this town just saw a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. You gave me hope when I had none, and I have spent 4 years hoping I could do the same for you." Ace stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched her cheek with calloused fingers that trembled slightly. "I thought about you every day in that prison," he said quietly. "Your letters were the only thing that kept me from going mad. I memorized them, read them until the paper fell apart. You became the reason I survived, the proof that good things still existed in the world. But I never let myself hope that you might want more from me than gratitude." "I want everything," Grace said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "If you will give it to me." Ace's hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, drawing her closer. "I have nothing to offer you. No money, no prospects, just a name with a prison record attached to it." "You have yourself," Grace said. "That is more than enough." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, tentative, as though he was afraid she might disappear. But Grace pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened, became something urgent and desperate, 4 years of longing compressed into a single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ace rested his forehead against hers. "I will work for you," he said. "I will earn my place here, prove that I am worth the risk you are taking." "You already proved that," Grace replied, "but I will not stop you from trying if it makes you feel better." He smiled then, that rare, transforming smile she had seen once in a courtroom and had been chasing ever since. "You are a remarkable woman, Grace Kennedy. And you are a good man, Ace Yardley, whether you believe it or not." Ace stayed. He took a room in the small bunkhouse Grace had built for her ranch hand, and he worked from sunup to sundown, rebuilding fences and breaking horses, and doing all the 100 tasks that came with running a ranch. He was good at the work, moved through it with the ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life. But more than that, he was good to Grace, treating her with a respect and gentleness that made her fall more in love with him every day, because she was in love with him. There was no point pretending otherwise. She loved the way he laughed at her jokes, the way he listened when she talked about her parents, the way he always took off his hat when he entered her house, as though it was sacred ground. She loved his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the way he treated everyone with dignity regardless of who they were. The town noticed, of course. People talked. Some of it was kind happiness that Grace had found someone after years alone. Some of it was less kind, whispers about convicts and fallen women and what people thought she was risking. Grace ignored it all. She had spent too many years caring what people thought, letting their opinions dictate her choices. Not anymore. Winter came, bringing cold nights and the kind of clear skies that made the stars look close enough to touch. Grace and Ace fell into an easy routine, working side by side during the day and sitting by the fire in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about the sister he had lost, and the father who had drunk himself to death. She told him about her mother's illness and her father's failing heart, about the terror of those months before Ace had saved her. "You ever regret it?" she asked one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold. "Giving me the money." Ace was quiet for a long moment. "I regretted prison," he said finally. "I regretted losing 4 years of my life, but I never regretted helping you. Even if you had never written to me, even if I had never seen you again, I would have been glad to know that you were free." Grace reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am glad you are here. So am I." He squeezed her hand gently. "More than I thought I could be glad about anything." In January, Ace asked her to marry him. He did it without a ring, standing in the barn while they were checking on a mare about to foal, his hands shaking as he took hers. "I know I am not what you deserve," he said. "I know you could do better than an ex-convict with nothing to his name. But I love you, Grace. I have loved you since the day I walked into your bakery and saw you standing there covered in flour, trying so hard to be brave. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the gift you have given me. Will you marry me?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in February in the same church where Ace had been tried and convicted. The minister who presided had been skeptical at first, concerned about Grace's choice, but when he saw the way Ace looked at her, the way he held her hand like she was something precious, his doubts faded. Margaret Foster cried through the entire ceremony. Most of the town attended, and if some people whispered about the speed of the courtship or the groom's past, their voices were drowned out by those who celebrated the union. Grace wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers from the desert. Ace wore a new suit purchased with money he had earned working the ranch, and when he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to honor you, to protect you, to love you for as long as I live. You gave me a reason to survive. I will spend my life giving you reasons to be happy." Their wedding night was sweet and tender, full of whispered promises and gentle exploration. Grace had been nervous, but Ace was patient, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bed she had once thought she would occupy alone forever, she felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is wrong?" Ace asked immediately, concern in his voice. "Nothing," Grace said, smiling through her tears. "Everything is right." "That is the problem. I am so happy I do not know what to do with it." Ace kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Get used to it," he said. "I plan to make you this happy every day for the rest of our lives." He kept that promise. The years that followed were not without challenges. Ranching was hard work, and money was sometimes tight. There were droughts and floods, sick cattle and broken equipment, all the trials that came with making a life from the unforgiving Arizona soil. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Grace continued running the bakery, though she hired more help as the ranch demanded more of her time. Ace took over most of the day-to-day operations, proving himself to be as skilled a rancher as he was a cowboy. He earned the respect of the other ranchers in the area, men who initially treated him with suspicion, but came to value his knowledge and integrity. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Ace while they were riding out to check the southern fence line, unable to wait any longer. He looked at her with such wonder, such joy, that she started crying again, happy tears that seemed to be her constant companion these days. "A baby," he said, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Ace said. He dismounted and lifted her down from her horse, holding her close. "I never thought I would have this. A wife, a home, a child. I never thought I deserved it." "Everyone deserves a fresh start," Grace reminded him, using the words that had changed both their lives. "Even you." Their son was born in December, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Daniel, after Grace's father, and he had Ace's blue eyes and Grace's dark hair. Ace cried when he held his son for the first time, big silent tears that rolled down his weathered cheeks as he stared at the tiny life in his arms. "I will never let anything happen to you," Ace promised his son in a whisper. "I will never let you grow up afraid or in debt or desperate. You will know only love and safety and home." Grace watched her husband make promises to their son and fell in love with him all over again. This man, who had been called a killer and a convict, who had lost years of his life to prison for defending himself, who had given everything he had to help a stranger, was now a father. He was her husband. He was the best man she had ever known. The years continued to pass, marked by the seasons and the growth of their family. A daughter, Emily, born 2 years after Daniel, with Grace's smile and Ace's quiet strength. Another son, Thomas, named for the sheriff whose death had brought Ace to trial, a gesture of forgiveness that some in town found strange but Grace thought necessary. Ace had never killed a man in malice, and the name was a reminder that even in tragedy, life could continue. The ranch prospered. Ace's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread, and they began supplying cattle to buyers as far away as California. The bakery became a fixture of Ash Fork, known throughout the territory for Grace's bread and pastries. They hired more workers, paid fair wages, and became the kind of employers that people wanted to work for. But despite their success, Ace and Grace never forgot where they had come from. They helped others who found themselves in desperate situations, paying debts anonymously, offering jobs to those who needed fresh starts. They became known as people who believed in second chances, who understood that circumstances could crush even the strongest person, and that kindness was never wasted. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grace and Ace took a rare day away from the ranch and the children, riding out to the place where they had first met, the bakery that had since expanded into a larger building. They stood outside, looking at the sign that read Kennedy's Bakery and Goods, and Grace leaned into her husband's side. "You remember the first time you came here?" she asked. "Every detail," Ace said. "You had flour on your cheek and fear in your eyes, and I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "I was 2 weeks from losing everything, and I had no idea how to save myself. And then a stranger walked in and bought bread. And then a stranger saved my life." Grace turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "You gave me everything, Ace. My home, my freedom, my future. You gave me love when I did not think I deserved it. You gave me a family and a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was standing in that bakery, covered in flour and out of options." Ace brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You saved me right back, Grace. I was a man with nothing, going nowhere, convinced I was only good for violence. You saw something in me worth loving. You gave me a reason to be better. Everything I am, everything good in my life comes from you." "We saved each other," Grace said softly. "Yes," Ace agreed. "We did." They stood there in the Arizona sunshine, two people who had found each other in the darkest moments of their lives and built something bright from the ashes of despair. Around them, Ash Fork continued its daily rhythm, people going about their business, children playing in the streets, the endless cycle of life in a small western town. But for Grace and Ace, this moment was everything. This was proof that kindness mattered, that second chances were worth giving, that love could grow in even the harshest conditions. "Take me home," Grace said eventually. "Our children will be wondering where we are." "Home," Ace repeated, the word holding a weight and warmth it never had before in his life. "I like the sound of that." They mounted their horses and rode back to the ranch together, side by side as they had faced everything for the past 10 years. The house came into view, painted white and surrounded by the garden Grace tended with the same care she gave everything she loved. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could hear the children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the desert wind. This was home. This was the fresh start they had both needed, the one Ace had paid for with everything he had and Grace had built with determined hope. This was love, real and lasting, born from the simple act of one person seeing another's need and choosing to help without expecting anything in return. As they dismounted and their children ran to greet them, Daniel already tall at 8 years old, Emily dancing around them with 4-year-old enthusiasm, and Thomas toddling behind on chubby legs, Grace caught Ace's eye and smiled. He smiled back, that same transforming smile that had made her heart skip the first time she saw it. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would never stop being grateful for the day a stranger walked into her bakery and changed her life forever. The years continued to unfold, bringing challenges and triumphs, sorrows and joys. Daniel grew into a young man who wanted to be a rancher like his father. Emily showed talent for baking that rivaled her mother's, and Thomas developed a love for horses that kept Ace busy teaching him to ride. They added more children to their family, twin girls born when Grace was 35, and each addition was celebrated with the same wonder and love that had marked Daniel's birth. Ace's prison record faded into history, replaced by a reputation for honesty and hard work that made people forget he had ever been anything other than a respected member of the community. When the town needed a new sheriff after Sheriff Douglas retired, they asked Ace to take the position. He declined, saying his place was on the ranch with his family, but the offer itself was proof of how far he had come. Grace expanded the bakery into a restaurant, serving meals alongside bread and pastries. It became a gathering place for the community, somewhere people came not just for food but for the warmth and welcome that Grace insisted upon. She hired people others would not give a chance to, former convicts and women fleeing bad situations, single mothers and drifters looking for stability. Each one received fair pay, respect, and the opportunity to prove themselves. "You are building an army of second chances," Ace teased her one evening as they reviewed the restaurant's accounts. "I learned from the best," Grace replied, kissing his cheek. "Besides, how can I not help when I remember what it felt like to be desperate?" On their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. The entire town seemed to attend, filling the house and yard with music and laughter. Grace and Ace danced together while their children watched, Daniel now a young man of 18 who had his father's height and his mother's kind heart. Emily at 16 already engaged to a young rancher from Flagstaff. Thomas at 14 working the ranch with the dedication of someone twice his age. And the twins, Sarah and Rebecca, 10 years old and inseparable. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Ace pulled Grace close and whispered in her ear. "Thank you." "For what?" Grace asked, though she was smiling because she knew. "For writing to me, for waiting for me, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." Ace's voice was thick with emotion. "I was a dead man walking when I gave you that money. I had nothing to live for, no future worth imagining. And then you wrote to me, and suddenly I had a reason to survive. You gave me a fresh start too, Grace. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, the kind she had gotten used to over 20 years of marriage to a man who never stopped making her grateful she had found him. "We saved each other," she said, echoing the words from their 10th anniversary. "And we will keep saving each other every day for as long as we both live." "I love you," Ace said, and after 20 years the words still made her heart skip. "I love you too," Grace replied, "now and always." They danced under the stars, surrounded by family and friends, two people who had started with nothing and built everything. The ranch spread out around them, successful and thriving. The children they had raised together were growing into fine adults. The community they had helped shape was stronger for their presence. It had all begun with an act of kindness from a stranger who saw a woman in need and chose to help without expecting anything in return. It had continued with a woman who refused to forget that kindness, who wrote letters to a man in prison and waited for him to come home. It had grown into love, deep and abiding, the kind that weathered storms and celebrated triumphs with equal grace. Years later, when Grace and Ace were old and gray, sitting on the porch of the ranch house watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Grace would sometimes think back to that day in the bakery when a tall cowboy had walked in and bought bread with money he could not afford to spare. She would think about the envelope that had appeared under her door, about the words that had changed her life. Everyone deserves a fresh start. Such simple words, such profound truth. Ace had given her a fresh start, and she had given him one in return. Together, they had built a life worth living, a legacy worth leaving, a love worth celebrating. And on quiet evenings, when the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, when the work was done and the children settled, Grace would take Ace's weathered hand in hers and think about how lucky they had been, how blessed to find each other in the darkness, how grateful for every day they had been given together. The cowboy had paid her debts secretly, expecting nothing in return, but he had received everything: love, family, home, belonging, a future bright enough to erase the darkness of his past, a reason to believe that good things could happen to broken people. And when their great-grandchildren asked, as children always do, how Grandma and Grandpa had met, Grace would smile and say, "He bought bread from my bakery and changed my life forever." And Ace would add, "She wrote to me when I had nothing and gave me hope." And their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would nod, understanding in the way that families do that this was a love story for the ages. This was what happened when two people chose kindness over convenience, hope over despair, love over fear. This was what happened when everyone got the fresh start they deserved. The end came peacefully for both of them, as these things sometimes do for people who have lived well and loved deeply. Ace went first at 78, dying in his sleep beside the woman he had loved for over 40 years. Grace followed 6 months later, unable to bear the absence of the man who had been her partner, her love, her salvation. They were buried side by side on the ranch they had built together, beneath the wide Arizona sky they had both loved. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to mourn them, but also to celebrate them, to remember the legacy of kindness and second chances they had left behind. And in the bakery that still bore the Kennedy name, now run by Emily's daughter, there hung a framed letter on the wall. It was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. Everyone deserves a fresh start. It was a reminder, a promise, a challenge. It was the beginning of a love story that had changed 2 lives and touched countless others. It was proof that kindness was never wasted, that love could bloom in the harshest conditions, that second chances were worth giving. It was the legacy of Grace Kennedy and Ace Yardley, the woman who had been drowning in debt and the cowboy who had saved her and in saving her had saved himself. Their story lived on in the town they had helped build, in the children they had raised, in the lives they had touched. It lived on in every act of unexpected kindness, every second chance given, every person who chose to help without expecting anything in return. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the money or the success or the years they had lived, but the love they had shared, the kindness they had given, the lives they had changed by simply choosing to believe that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserved a fresh start. And in Ash Fork, Arizona, under the endless desert sky, that belief lived on. A testament to 2 people who had found each other in darkness and built something bright. A reminder that love stories do not always start with love at first sight. Sometimes they start with an act of kindness. Sometimes they start with bread and an extra dime. Sometimes they start with words on a page. Everyone deserves a fresh start. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, that fresh start leads to everything you never knew you needed. Everything you never thought you could have. Everything that makes life worth living. That was the gift Ace Yardley had given Grace Kennedy that day in the bakery. That was the gift she had given him in return with her letters and her love and her willingness to wait. That was their story. That was their legacy. That was their love. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.